Society of the Snow was recently released on Netflix, and it quite literally took my breath away when watching it. I thought it was a delicately handled and respectful depiction of the air crash of Flight 571, and it was such a powerful watch. At the time of watching it, little did I know that there was a movie out there called Alive which was based on the exact same air crash which was released in 1993. So today I gave that movie a watch, and to be fair, there were a lot of similarities. But at the same time, there were a lot of differences too. So I thought I'd compare both movies, look at which one was closer to the true events, and ultimately determine which one was better. So let's get into it. Here is Society of the Snow versus Alive, which movie is better and tells the truer story. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. Now, both of these movies did have a lot of similarities in terms of the way that the events were told through the story, but that's understandable due to the fact that there are survivors from the crash and they're able to describe what the actual events were like. So the way that the timeline unfolded was pretty much the same across both of them. What I found particularly interesting was the fact that scenes from both movies were very similar. Like, it was almost just fast forwarded 30 years and Society of the Snow just made it look a lot more stylistic and nice on the eye from a viewing experience. I think this was most apparent with the scenes that took place on the plane, as that was probably the easiest thing to replicate from reality, as they knew what the plane would have looked like at the time. Both plane crash scenes were very well executed and inflicted fear. I would say that Alive did a good job at building up the suspense and tension before the crash, especially when we saw that the pilots were trying to avoid the mountain, and the crash itself was very similar to what we saw in Society of the Snow. Extremely brutal, and it didn't hold back in what we saw. However, there was a moment during the crash where they were all just sitting still, which just confused me slightly, and it didn't quite match up with what else was going on in the build-up. Whereas in Society of the Snow, it felt like there was panic present, and instead of witnessing the crash from around head height, a lot of it was from the chair's height, which made it feel a lot more claustrophobic and like there was quite literally no escape. The passengers were screaming, there was fear, and it felt like I was there. One of the main things that I felt Society of the Snow did a lot better than Alive was making the environment feel like the villain, and the true thing that needed to be overcome in order for survival to be a possibility. The vast empty space was something which had a key focus and was kept at the forefront throughout the entirety of the movie. On the expeditions, we saw just how difficult it was for them to get from A to B, and I genuinely felt cold whilst watching the movie, something which I was extremely impressed by. The frost on their face, accompanied by the close-up shots and the sound of the frost cracking, really made you feel what they were feeling. Whereas when watching Alive, whilst they did often include shots of the plane crash site from a distance, some of the moments felt a bit more unrealistic and exaggerated. Such as this one here when Roberto nearly fell off the edge. I don't know how true that was, as I couldn't find anything on it when I was researching, but to me that didn't instill long-term fear of the surroundings. It just made me fearful for the character's safety at that moment. Whereas in Society of the Snow, it felt like the biggest thing was the weather, and the fact that on this earth where there are 8 billion people, for the first time in their lives they were truly invisible. Nobody could hear them, nobody could see them, and the temperature was dropping and making it even more difficult to be able to survive. Alive gave a lot more screen time to characters that we didn't really get to see in Society of the Snow. There was no overarching narrator like there was with Numa. There was just an interview that took place at the start and at the end. But instead, we kind of saw the movie from the perspective of Antonio, Roberto, and Nando, with all of the communication that happened going through them. Whereas Society of the Snow mainly focused on the perspective of Numa, having him be the narrator and us hearing him tell the story from the angle after the crash. At the time, we didn't know that Numa was somebody that sadly died, but I feel it was a really beautiful approach for the movie to take. By utilizing Numa, it gave the people that didn't make it just as much of a focus as the people that did survive. We heard the story through the voice of somebody that never returned home, which meant that they wouldn't be forgotten. They were just as important in this story as those that survived, and they deserved their story told too. So I thought it was a really powerful way of telling the events and keeping the victims at the forefront, and not allowing them to be forgotten. When it comes to the way that the movie looked, the 90s one looked very, well, early 90s. It's not the nicest on the eye, it's not graded in the most complimentary of ways, and it's a little rough, but it's definitely watchable. Whereas when you compare it to Society of the Snow, this movie is stunning to look at. From the shots that make you feel like you're there, to the plane crash, to the slight grain that the entire movie had, to the vast nothingness that we're often reminded by, and even the way that the characters changed over time. It felt so real and intimate, and I can't fault it from a visual perspective. And that's what almost blew me away the most, because they utilized every channel possible in order to make this feel like an experience that was being relived, and it was harrowing to watch. It wasn't just a movie. When the story was being told in Alive, it all felt very compartmentalized and we wouldn't really see the trouble that the group would go through. For example, when they went to find the tail of the plane, it was a brief, maybe 1 minute piece of traveling, and then when they returned to the crash site, it was just a straight cut. So it kind of made it feel a bit choppy in places. This was also present at the end with the expedition that Nando and Roberto went on. They traveled for a couple of days and then went off even further, and then it just cut to the helicopter arriving and rescuing them. I also feel like this kind of approach was tied into the decisions that the characters made as well. For example, the decision around not consuming each other after death didn't feel like it had the weight that it did in Society of the Snow. The moral and religious conflict felt like a really big decision that needed to be made in the more recent movie, and in reality, some people even died because they refused to eat another person. Whereas in this movie, it was mentioned, and then within a couple of minutes, they'd changed their minds. Society of the Snow, despite having a similar runtime, really managed to make all of the timeline flow so seamlessly from one event into the other, and for the weight around decisions to feel like they had greater meaning and caused division amongst others. The decision around consuming each other and the guilt that they felt was something which was always so prominent in the movie, and it was never pushed to the side. The grief that people felt was also something that I thought was delivered best in this movie too. When somebody died, you felt the weight of it and the death count going up. One thing in Alive that I found quite distracting at points and almost took me out of the movie was the plane mechanic that was placed into it. He was this crazy type of character that was there, and from a tonal perspective, he felt so different to everybody else that it almost disrupted the realistic nature of what I was hoping to watch unfold. This type of person wasn't in Society of the Snow, and if they were, it would have really disrupted it, even more so than in Alive. There was an aircraft mechanic that sadly died during the avalanche part of the timeline, but I haven't seen it documented that he acted like what he did in Alive, so I wasn't a big fan of that. When it comes to the portrayal of the people, I feel Society of the Snow blows Alive out of the water. Each and every one of the people in Society of the Snow felt far more convincing, and as I mentioned before, a lot more real with their performances. The facial acting, visual, and audible performances far outweighed Alive. But again, I do think that's probably something that's just to do with the time that the original movie came out. Things change in terms of performing, and the approach of Society of the Snow was far more focused on being an immersive viewing experience, so that would have influenced the type of performance that the cast gave. For me, I have to say that Society of the Snow is far better than Alive in every way possible. I didn't feel a fraction of the powerful, moving nature in Alive than what I did with the most recent retelling. There's a lot of people saying that this is a remake of Alive, but I must say that I don't feel like it is at all. It's just a retelling of the tragic event that happened in a far more powerful, stylistic, and emotional way. When it comes to which movie is closer to the actual events, I would most likely have to say that even though they are very similar, there were things that were factually correct and incorrect in both. But overall, what's important is that they both tell a true story, with most details being correct of what actually happened. Most of Society of the Snow is what actually happened, and in my other video I go into full detail, but Alive did also have some intricate details such as lighting fires and reading comic books. Something which wasn't in Society of the Snow. But I would say that if you're looking for a far more accurate and something which feels like a real telling of the events, I would watch Society of the Snow. Not only is it better, but it feels like the true events that it does tell us have more weight to them and you get to see it taking place, rather than it sometimes just cutting. So Society of the Snow wins. So, there you have it, Society of the Snow versus Alive. If you want to see my full review on Society of the Snow, then click on the card in the top corner, or alternatively you can head over to my channel where you'll find them all. And finally, if you'd like to see what I rate the latest movies that don't quite make the cut to getting a dedicated video, then head over to my Letterboxd profile. I rated both of these movies over there, so if you'd like to see what I gave them, then it's there. Which movie did you prefer? Leave a comment down below. and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.